In the January edition of Spectator World, Mary Harrington says the pandemic has not just revealed but widened class divides. The upper classes can jet off, like Kim Kardashian did, to their own private island and avoid it all, and the middle classes can work from their laptops at home or an Airbnb. The working classes, though, she writes, have been forced to keep on working in restaurants, bars and hotels. To discuss, Mary joins me now. Mary, for the Spectator's World January edition, you write a piece where you begin by talking about a wedding. What was the significance of this wedding?
It caused a significant stir across the United States just for its sheer extravagance. It was reported in the pages of Vogue. As far as I can make out, it went on for at least 3 days. Every single detail of it was wildly expensive and wildly curated. I mean, it was mesmerising. It had a sort of Marie Antoinette energy about it. You know, every dress cost thousands. Every detail of it was just sort of wildly kind of sybaritic to a degree which is unimaginable, I think, to most ordinary people, simply because that's just not the world we live in. You know, we might be able to choose whether to go to this restaurant or that restaurant, but the idea of, you know, inviting sort of 1,000 of your closest friends to a wedding party, or however many it was, and then offering them IV drips to deal with the hangover at the after party picnic the following morning, it's just a bit beyond most people's normal frame of reference. It had a kind of end of civilization, kind of hyper wealthy decadence to it, which I think just struck a very strange note at the end of a pandemic when a lot of people have been going through some really quite grim times.
And this is a wedding involving Ivy Getty from the wealthy Getty family. But in your piece, you make the example that this is, a sign of how COVID has not just highlighted, but actually exacerbated class divisions in society. Can you talk us through almost the various parts of that? Because there's one, obviously, the upper classes, you could call them, but there's another group, which is perhaps one that probably more people watching this could, compare their lifestyles to rather than this wedding.
So I outlined the ways in which Ivy Getty's wedding and also the Met Gala, which was not long before that, exemplified a very stark division which has been more I think, revealed than anything else by the pandemic, which is to say asymmetric rules on masking. It's now routine for people who are serving others of higher status to remain masked, while people who command higher status, whether permanently or temporarily, are exempt from that for whatever reason. And one example I gave was Ivy Getty's wedding, where the wedding party and Nancy Pelosi, who officiated, swept into the town hall, at which point all the attendees, all the guests, ritually put their masks on. But the wedding party remained unmasked. You know, the same was very visible at the Met Gala. Photographs show that the guests were unmasked, but all the serving people were masked uniformly. And that was even visible at the beginning of the pandemic when Kim Kardashian tweeted from the private island where she'd arranged a get-together with all of her extended family, and they were all pictured hugging and drinking and having a lovely time while all of us were locked down or, saying goodbye to our dying grandmas through the nursing home window. Meanwhile, there are serving staff in the background collecting empties with their masks on at Kim Kardashian's private island. So that's so much for the aristocracy, who are, as it were, permanently exempt from masking. And masking, I think, stands as a kind of symbol of status in this way. Whether or not you're entitled to in-person human interaction. The Zoom class, I've tried to show how, if you're a member of the Zoom class, which is to say people who do knowledge work, I'd class myself, I suppose, as a member of that class. I work remotely. I could take my laptop and in theory work from anywhere. That class is sometimes gets to enjoy the mask-free privileges of the sort of Kardashians of this world, and at other times don't, and are also characterised by being extraordinarily neurotic about infection control. And I cited as an example an article in The Atlantic which reported a man going to a different wedding in New Orleans, where he panicked all the way through about the terrible riskiness of interacting in a normal way, mask-free, despite the fact that everybody who attended the wedding parties was already vaccinated. And then, as far as I could make out, absolutely freaked out when he caught COVID as a consequence of that, and hired an apartment down the road from his family, where his children would come and visit him, sitting 6 feet or more away on the porch wearing an N95 mask, which suggests a a fairly extreme degree of anxiety about contamination, which to my eyes shades over from being sort of strictly medical and rational into something more like a sort of fears for spiritual purity. And I would say this has become increasingly characteristic of the Zoom class. And further down the food chain, that just simply isn't practically possible, because these are the people who are serving, in all of these settings. The people who collect rubbish bins or do care work or whatever, have done their best to manage infection control. But if you work with people on a daily basis as your job and can't work remotely, it's just not possible to become that neurotic about in-person human contact. It just isn't, because you remain in contact with people just by virtue of the nature of your work. And I think it's and what I really wanted to draw out was the way the pandemic has both stratified those classes in a much more extreme way, because it's not only rendered the divisions more visible, but it's also increased the difficulty of navigating back and forth between these classes.
Yeah, and
it's widened divisions between the richest and the poorest. I believe Jeff Bezos, for example, has added something like a multiple to his total wealth, while plenty of other people just went under.
And I wanted, Mary, do you think historically this is surprising? I mean, ultimately, you, I suppose, might expect, right or wrong, I think when you say wrong, that the rich will be the people who manage to have the least harm done to them in a crisis often, will be the ones who have the options when it comes to whether it's a private island or, getting away for something, or just making your own surroundings much more pleasant.
I think that's absolutely true. It's the famous, the rich do what they want, or the rich do what they can, and the poor suffer what they must. I think is as the famous saying has it. And that's probably always been the case. But what I really wanted to draw out in this article was the way that there's a sort of tragedy at work in terms of how this has played out within the sort of middling sort, the middle class, which has been undergoing a process of hollowing out, which has been detectable not just in America but across the West for some years, really since the Thatcher years. Then the economic the liberalisation of finance and deindustrialisation, the outsourcing of industry, all of which has begun a slow, methodical breaking down of middle class prosperity and to a significant extent working class prosperity as well across the West, in a way which is now increasingly starting to reveal itself as a very much starker and more stratified class hierarchy, across all of these geographies, where moving back and forth across these class barriers is just considerably more difficult. And what I really wanted to draw out was the irony of where the resistance is coming from in the West to masking and pandemic control measures, because a lot of it is actually coming from a sort of a more old-fashioned conservative bourgeoisie, many of whom were also right behind the economic reforms which have ended up hollowing out a lot of the sort of middle class prosperity, which is now being replaced by this very much more sort of information-led Zoom class, and much thinner middle class. Whereas increasingly on both sides, as Joel Kotkin points out also in the January issue, instead we're seeing something very much more like a new feudalism.
You mentioned the narrowing of the middle class. So if you have the Zoom class and you're talking about the laptop class, you can ultimately go where they want to do, or perhaps aspire to live the lifestyles you talk about of the upper classes, the Gettys. What's happening to those who no longer fit into that middle class? Where do they now fit? Is that working class or something else?
I mean, these things are obviously complex and vary a lot by geography, but I suppose you could characterize a lot of what's happening, and a lot of what's happening in the culture war particularly, as a contest between this sort of emerging Zoom class, the knowledge class with their portable-ish laptop work that can happen from anywhere, and a much more place-based bourgeoisie, which might be characterised by small business owners, for example, or people whose prosperity is connected to a particular geography, such as some smallholders, landowners, small business owners, people who you might characterise, I suppose, as a sort of old-fashioned yeomanry, and that's the class which is shrinking. And that's the class that you find lined up behind figures such as Donald Trump, with a certain amount of incoherence in their argument, and a certain number, and that brings a number of contradictions to the fore. But I think what we're looking at is a genuine set of class grievances and a genuine sense of threat at a whole sort of economic order and way of life which is becoming increasingly unstable and is being contested by an emerging new variant of the middle class, which just doesn't have the same commitments to place and has a wholly different set of economic interests. And I think those tensions are really only just starting to play out.
And just finally, on this week's episode, we've been talking a lot about Boris Johnson, the trouble the government is in, and it all plays into this narrative that we saw with Dominic Cummings and Barnard Castle of one rule for them. And it's been a really corrosive political narrative in lots of countries. You've seen it in various governments. But I wonder, when we're going back to these mask rules and talking about the wedding, Kim Kardashian's holiday, are we just seeing a more sophisticated version of this? Because it's not so much a breach of the rules, it's almost a new set of rules, the rules are almost designed to allow for this inequality.
I certainly don't think that's how ordinary people perceive it. I'm not. If I'm honest, I'm not. I mean, I couldn't really speculate. But my hunch is it's unlikely to be even how our political leaders see it. It's. I suspect that some form of masking rituals and class stratifications will persist, but in terms of our immediate political situation, my gut feel is that actually what's going on is something more like they've decided, people have more or less consciously decided that the pandemic is over or it's nearly over, and they'd like to pin as much of the collective misery of the British public and everything we've all undergone over the last year and a half or 2 years onto Boris Johnson as possible, and to designate him, as it were, as a kind of sin eater, and just to blame as much of that on him as possible, and then load him up with the outrage that comes attendant on the fact that he wasn't even really following the rules himself, and then defenestrate him so that somebody with relatively clean hands can be installed. Certainly if I were a Tory politician, that's what I'd be doing if I wanted to have a fighting chance of winning the next election. So I don't really think there's anything sort of large scale going on about public manners. I suspect it's much more about just brute politics.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks for joining us today. That's it for this week. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and do join us again next week.